Hey, thank you all for joining us. We're with Daniel Yergin, who is vice chair of S&P Global. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning author. He's looked at as one of the world's greatest, most thoughtful, and just writing gurus on global energy markets. And most importantly, he is the author of a book I think everyone should read entitled The New Map: Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. Dan Yergin, thank you so much for joining us today. When you think about where America's energy vector is pointing, which is just sort of a mix of renewables and a mix of fossils, of new energy sources along that. What are your worries about our blind spots on energy infrastructure as we move forward?
I think there are about three things. One is simply the scale of it, given that we're well over a 20 trillion, probably $23 trillion economy, and that is 80% roughly dependent on the hydrocarbons to change it. I think the second is what you're going to be talking about, I know, in the future, which is permitting, the ability to get things done. And the third is that we're not looking at the reality of the dependencies as we try and move from one system to another.
So, when you think about the permitting side of it, I think one of the interesting questions about that is that John Podesta and other people on the progressive left of the energy and climate equation have been saying we need permitting reform because the large scale projects that were funded out of the IRA are going to see those dollars stranded if they don't have projects they can move into. So, can you tell us your take on permitting reform? And is there an equilibrium possible between the hydrocarbon world and the renewable energy world?
I think that's the only way to really move forward is with a thorough permitting reform that covers the whole thing. Obviously, the administration is very focused on transmission lines, but we need pipelines too. We need, and simply if you're going to do carbon capture, you need permitting. And it's just astonishing because it seems like such a, nitty gritty type issue, but it's years and years to get things done. If we had had the kind of permitting system we have now, when Dwight Eisenhower was president, we would never have had an national interstate highway system.
One of the things that you outline in the book is you have a concern that as we move in more to a less carbon dependent economy, that the regulatory environment can take us to a place where the need for energy is greater than, particularly hydrocarbons, is greater than the regulatory world that we're creating and sculpting. And the net effect of that is that you create a spike and a squeeze in prices in the hydrocarbon world. Can you explain that to our audience a little bit?
Well, we probably already have had the first energy crisis of the energy transition in the 6 months before the Ukraine war, because that's when prices really spiked. That's when you had shortages. That's when you had Europe already in trouble. And it's a mismatch between the targets and the regulatory mechanisms on one side and the realities of supply on the other. In addition, Steve, one of the things I really focused on in the new map and continue to focus on, it's a question people really got to look at, is the new supply chains that will be required for a net zero world, which means a lot more mining. And guess what? Mining needs permitting. And guess what? Mining also means the U.S., which is already heavily dependent on the other parts of the world, will become more dependent. And by the way, that's where it clashes with this new great power competition between the U.S. and China, because China has such a preeminent position in minerals around the world and in processing minerals.
Well, let me ask you about that because we just had a G7 meeting in Hiroshima, Japan. Many people say they've never seen the G7 nations, Canada, Germany, France, UK, Italy, the United States, all aligned as closely. And really, you could call it the China Concern Summit. And it just made me wonder whether it's high tech, whether it's concerns about energy, whether it's concern about critical minerals. Do you think that we have to, for the West, essentially the West plus Japan, to succeed in its energy aspirations and transitions, that it somehow has to come to a deal with China?
Well, I think, by the way, I think you can also call it an Inflation Reduction Act, a Compete with China Act. It's
Right.
in very much in that same spirit, and that carried over into the G7 summit. Also, notice in the G7 summit was a more open summit on the subject of natural gas, realizing the scale of natural gas that's needed for energy transition, replacing coal in Southeast Asia. China kind of dominates the processing of a lot of minerals. And it's not going to be easy to create an alternative system, particularly given how long it is to get anything done. One of the things that really surprised me when I was writing the new map was looking at how long it takes to develop a major new mine. It's 16 or 20 years. And if we look at copper demand to meet the kind of goals for the 2050, world copper demand would really have to double by the late 2030s. And by the way, as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act, we're looking at how much more will be needed in minerals. And you just don't quite see where that's all going to come from. And it does get you into that great power competition and this overarching issue of China and the West.
One of the other minerals that's part of EVs and the renewable transportation sector, which we're also talking about today, is lithium. And I recently had dinner with the CEO of Lithium Americas, and I said, is all the lithium in Nevada and Australia and Africa? And he goes, no. He says, it's all over the world. But he said, in Canada and some places in the United States, we have huge, huge lithium deposits available, but not mineable. And that North America could be a lithium superpower if you could mine it. Is that a problem?
Well, it does look like the U.S. has many spots where there's lithium, but it's A, commercial, and B, can you get it permitted and get it done? And, the hostility towards mining is really as great as the hostility towards oil and gas development. It's many of the same issues. And so you still are you going to look to Argentina? You're going to look to Bolivia? Where are you going to go for these minerals? Basically, the state of California said every new car sold in California after 2035 has to have 2.5 times more copper than a conventional car. 40% of world copper comes from 2 countries right now, Peru and Chile. And in Peru, the president's in jail, and in Chile, the government is rather hostile to mining. And you look around the world again and you see who is in mining around the world, who has already staked out big positions. And you do see in a lot of places it's China.
I want our audience to know that the new map is not just all about a kind of dense treatment of energy sources and, this kind of, wonky book. It is full of human stories. It is a book filled with human vignettes of how we got where we are.
Well, one of my favorite stories in the new map is the story of where Tesla came from. There's a young man, J.B. Straubel, who in 2003 goes to, I think it was a fish restaurant in Los Angeles with Elon Musk, trying to convince him to do an electric airplane. And Musk says, no, I'm not interested. He says, well, what about an electric car? And Musk says, I might be interested in that. Of course, there was a tiny Tesla before that, but that's when he gets involved. And J.B. Straubel becomes the chief technology officer. And a few years ago, Musk said, if there hadn't been for that lunch, there might not have been a Tesla. And if there hadn't been a Tesla, you wouldn't see all the automobile makers in the world rushing to come out with their electric models. So I think that is, kind of the big wild card out there is what's happening in innovation right now. At our CERAWeek conference, our big energy conference in Houston, we had 225 startups. Right now, suddenly, 5 years ago, people would have said fusion is 50 years away. Now they're saying 5, 10, 15 years away. So I think innovation will be where the surprises will come and will provide the answers. The question is the timing, trying to push things so fast. And is the system going to be able to do it? Are you going to be able to put system B and replace system A with system B when system B isn't really in place yet?
Dan, you won a Pulitzer Prize for your writing, Commanding Heights, and kind of looking at the prize, looking at, the scramble of great power competition over oil and energy. And I'm just wondering, when I read the new map, again, read it, folks, because it will transform your understanding of so many of the deeper dimensions of these choices that societies are making. But I think that the real question I have is whether we're creating the conditions again of the 1970s, that the ongoing dependence on hydrocarbons as we're trying to make an energy transition creates opportunities for other great powers to shift and kind of control that. We're seeing rumblings from Saudi Arabia on cutting back oil production. We're seeing China become a global diplomat by way of dealing with a lot of the energy issues. Do you have any concerns that America is not just keeping up with that game and that other players are trying to create conditions of creating those 1970s squeezes on oil and gas again?
Well, I think it was quite a shock, really, to have China mediating a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That was a surprise, and I don't think we've ever really seen China play that kind of role again. My first book was actually on the origins of the Soviet-American Cold War. When I was writing the new map, I felt kind of I was writing a history of a new Cold War. I
Hmm.
think if we squeeze resources in the United States and elsewhere, it is going to create higher dependence on the Middle East. So we'll see that in terms of oil and gas. What we have seen, however, is the shale revolution in the U.S. The U.S. has this. You were just in Warsaw. What you know now. I mean, the world has recognized, at least Europe has recognized, is that U.S. LNG, liquefied natural gas exports, are fundamental to their energy security. And that would not have been seen 2 or 3 years ago. And that will continue. But I think, Steve, you're also pointing to the fact that we're creating new dependencies on minerals to a degree that people just are not calculating. And with that will come new geopolitical risks, new geopolitical tensions, and new challenges.
Is there anything the Biden administration is getting right that you want to mention and getting wrong that you want to mention on
Well,
the
I
energy
think
front?
Well, I think if we take the IRA, I think the great thing about this bill is that it's agnostic. It provides incentives across the board. It doesn't say this energy, that. Now, how the regulations, how the tax credits, guidance are written, that will be important. And that's so different. I just came back from Europe, and in the European way to do it is to write very tight regulations, telling people with bureaucrats in Brussels telling companies what to do. So I think the IRA is really a unique form of legislation, as well as in terms of the size and its impact of it. And I think surprises will come out in terms of innovation. Obviously, getting this permitting thing sorted out, this has to be a bipartisan effort, because without it, you can put all the money into it, but if you can't build things, you're not going to get things done.
Fascinating. Let me just ask you finally, are you aware of any major projects out there? Maybe you've got dozens, so many you can't remember them, but are permitting projects that have not been able to move forward because of the paralysis at many different levels in the permitting process, federal, state, local?
Well, I think it's clear on transmission lines. That's a huge problem getting it done, even bringing wires onshore for offshore wind. And then there's a famous Mountain Valley pipeline, which Senator Manchin will talk about, which is like 95% done, a $3 billion project that's gone to $6 billion. Can't get the last 25 miles done. Uh, uh, those are the type, so there, I mean, you could make such a long list. Maybe that's when you're doing is just to make a list of all these things that are not happening because our permitting system is so inefficient and so complicated, and it ends up with just plain paralysis.
Let me just ask you finally, Dan, China. Is does China and its investment in solar and, well, across the board, nuclear, new forms of nuclear, and across every form of energy track out there, is as I look at it and what China is doing, I just wonder if the United States is further and further in the back seat of driving global energy realities. And just love to get your take on China.
Well, I think first of all, what the U.S. has is a great advantage, is we are the most innovative nation, and we have ecosystems that no other country has. With that said, China has made a major commitment. About half of the installed wind and solar in the world, still 57% roughly of their electricity comes from coal. But and I think what we're now beginning to see, and and it's one of the things I wrote about in the new map and said is coming down the road, is China was developing electric cars not only because of climate environment, not only to reduce the growth of its dependence on oil, but because it recognized that it could not get into the global car market with internal combustion engines. It was
Hmm.
too late. It wants to be at the front runner in terms of electric cars. So I think we're going to see a lot more competition from Chinese electric cars coming into the market. And on top of that, China, is about 90% of the world's solar panels, lithium batteries. You go down the list, they're there, and we're not there yet.
Dan Yergin, thank you so much for joining us today for our major Semafor Infrastructure Summit.
Thank you, Steve.